In the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, there's a passage that's repeated that you all know very well. It says, ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall find, knock and the door will be open to you. But there's a version of that in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas that I much prefer. He takes the second piece of that, the word seeking, and he expands it and shows what it really, really involves. So that's the reading I've chosen today. And there are different versions of this Gospel of Thomas from different sources, most of which were discovered in the Nag Hammadi scrolls, but some coming from earlier, the Oxyrhynchus scrolls. So I've chosen a version that I prefer. Here it is. The one who seeks should not stop seeking until he finds. And when he finds, he will be disturbed. And when he is disturbed, he will be amazed. And when he is amazed, he will rule over all. And when he rules, he will rest. Words inspired by God. On Holy Thursday, 2021, I had a really powerful visionary experience that I shared subsequently, I think, on Easter Sunday of last year. And in this dream vision, I'm on a huge big beach, beautiful beach with golden sands stretching as far as the eye can see. And there are tens of thousands of people on the beach. But because the beach is so great, there's no sense of kind of clustering or kind of not having enough room. There's plenty of space for everybody. And then in this vision, I got elevated way above the beach, maybe 10,000 feet into the air, so that the people on the beach looked like just dots on the ground, like pixels on a computer screen. And while I had been on the beach, I realized that everybody was carrying a sombrero, huge big sombrero, but not on their heads. They were carrying it by their side. And I saw that there were 4 different colored sombreros. There were blue ones and green ones and black ones and white ones. And so when I elevated way above, and now I'm seeing all these people that look like just little pixels on the beach scattered throughout the beach. And all of a sudden there's music, as if there's some kind of a cosmic conductor playing music. And the people begin to assemble in some way, and they put on the sombreros. And so all I can see now is the colors. I can see blues and greens and blacks and whites. And as if there was some extraordinary choreographer, they began to mesh into different forms. And 2 groups of them formed 2 circles, side-by-side circles. And they moved within the circles. And I suddenly realized that the people wearing the blue hats represented the ocean, and the people wearing the green hats represented dry land. And it was a perfect articulation if you were to look at the globe from a distance and could see the oceans and the lakes, and you could see the dry land. And the 2 side-by-side circles were like the 2 hemispheres of the earth. So we had the Americas with the Pacific on one side and the Atlantic on the other side in one of the circles. And the other one you had Eurasia and Japan and Australia and Tasmania on the other side with the waters of the Pacific and the green for dry land. And then underneath, there was another group that formed like a rectangle. And the people wearing the black hats were like the pixels on a page of print. And the ones wearing the white hats were the kind of the white background that made the black pixels stand out. And I saw that there was a phrase being written in that rectangle. And the phrase was, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so that's the overall context in which I want to treat of today's topic, because part of it is going to be very, very dark and part of it is going to be filled with light. But I want to hold the entire thing in that container, that there was the vision telling us that the word became flesh and dwelt among us. So wherever our journey takes us, however we have to kind of dig into what the reality of our lives are like, we have to hold this realization that the word is among us, that in fact, every single one of us is a word of God made flesh. And so I'm continuing today the theme that I took up 2 weeks ago and last week. And then God willing, on the 29th, when I come back, I'm going to do a recap of those 3 homilies and do a Q&A. And so today I want to finish this exploration of the light and the dark. And the first, so I'm going to call this homily, I'm going to call it Great Reset and Great Awakening. So firstly, I want to dig into the darkness a little bit. And I'm going to call this section the worldwide war. And I look, in my experience, there are two radically different kinds of darkness that we encounter. There's the darkness that results in spiritual wisdom. It is the darkness of the Celts when they talk about light being born from the womb of darkness, or what the Buddha talked about when he said, form is emptiness and emptiness is form. So there's a darkness which is kind of the fertile, fecund womb of all that emerges subsequently. So that is the darkness, we want to kind of embrace, and wait for the birthing process. But there's another kind of darkness, and it's a darkness which does not result in spiritual wisdom. It results in a kind of a spiritual dementia. And our world is always in danger of falling into the latter. When you read throughout human history again and again and again, you see this oscillation between the darkness that confers spiritual wisdom and the darkness that results in a kind of a spiritual dementia. And certainly we're at a period of world history where we're experiencing the kind of the spiritual dementia, a kind of darkness. It's a time in human history when we're watching some of our institutions seem to be hell-bent on accelerating this form of senility. And when I try to trawl human history in its totality, I see that people and cultures react very, very differently when they encounter somebody whom they don't know. And I'm going to walk through that very, very, very briefly. So there are some times when we regard somebody whom we don't know immediately as an enemy, and it arises in us, it creates hostility towards the other, and we begin to attack. So it's a fight or flight syndrome. So when we meet that which we do not know, one reaction is to treat it as an enemy figure, to flee from it or to attack it. Another position is when you meet somebody whom you don't know, it's a stranger, not necessarily an enemy, but you want to avoid the person because you have suspicion as to their intentions. You have no idea what their agenda is. So you treat them with suspicion and you tend to avoid them. There's another group in which when they meet somebody whom they don't previously know and they see the other person as a resource, somebody who can be enslaved in some fashion. So some kind of greed takes over. How can I utilize this person or these people to my own economic advantage? And then there's another position where when you meet somebody whom you don't know, you realize it is a fellow citizen and your reaction is to befriend them and to treat them with justice. That's a totally different reaction to meeting somebody whom you don't know. There's another position, which is realizing that everybody whom you meet is actually a sibling of yours, and you reach out in compassion and in love for them. And the most important position of all, at some stage, if we can get there as individuals and as a community, is realizing that everybody you meet is part of your soul pod. It's another fractal of source. And therefore, it's an invitation into unity consciousness. Now, so that, again, is the two forms of darkness that I see when I trawl human history. Now, I want to dig into the dark part of that, the darkness of senility for a few minutes. And then for the rest of the homily, I'll focus on the light that we need to embrace. So I look at this, what's been called the Great Reset. And I look at the weapons of the Great Reset. And this is a form of, very definitely, I would call it spiritual dementia. And so groups like the World Economic Forum, who are training young global leaders to advance an agenda of a kind of a Marxist totalitarian system, where, in Klaus Schwab's words, you will own nothing and be happy. You'll survive on what's called a social credit score. And depending how well you behave and align yourselves with the agenda of the tyrants, you'll be entitled to education, or housing, or travel, or medical attention, or food, or financial security. But if you don't obey the agenda, all these get cut off from you. Part of the Great Reset is a kind of a transhumanism. I've spoken about this in the past as, I call it, Homo artificialis, trying to create cyborgs who are both programmable and hackable. Then you've got international organizations like the WHO and the UN, which are trying to take control completely from individual nations and to supersede them and decide what treatments will be suitable for what kinds of medical conditions going into the future. Have I been watching the propagandizing of our children all the way from kindergarten through college and their addiction to the mass media and social media. And I'm sure you're all aware of the extraordinary censorship where only a particular perspective is allowed on all of the important issues, and where there is constant surveillance in which we become just a part of the Internet of Things, where your refrigerator and your electronic devices are actually spying on you. And then we become the Internet of Beings, where actually human beings become part of this Internet system, so that there's constant surveillance of every single one of us. There's been an effort, obviously, to destroy the notion of gender, to destroy family, to destroy religion, and to destroy civil rights. So that is the darkness, that is the womb, that is the darkness which leads to spiritual dementia. And we're certainly experiencing that in our world right now. Now, what is the reaction and the response to that? And it is the Great Awakening. And I'm going to spend the rest of the homily focusing on that piece. I believe that the future of humanity is not about mega churches or about mega institutions like the WHO or the UN, but is about small networks of communities, that create their own financial systems, their own farming, their own storytelling, their own education, and their own medicine. It will be small communities which are self-sufficient, networking with other small communities that are also self-sufficient. And I've been blessed personally in the last year to meet a whole lot of people who are involved in that enterprise. Just in this last year alone. A few weeks ago, I had an interview with a man called Alan Schoen, actually very, very well known vet who has kind of psychic abilities. And to realize what he's trying to do, he's living in British Columbia, and what he's attempting to do at this stage of his life, he's in his 70s at this stage, around veterinary practice and how to make that something which is really beautiful for the animals, for the humans, and for the communities. I've had the experience of meeting several times now with Regina Meredith. In fact, I'll be going back down to Colorado on Tuesday to do 2 interviews with her and a new friend that I've made, a man called Paul Wallace, an Australian, who's written 3 beautiful books, all of which I've read. So we're going to engage in a trialogue, Regina and Paul Wallace and myself, on how to reinterpret the scriptural traditions and the mythologies of the world, and to liberate ourselves from any form of tyranny. I've had the privilege of meeting an Irishman called Paul O'Rourke, who attended our services here on several occasions, and he's creating these small communities around self-sufficiency for food. And just last week, I did an interview with a man from Northern Ireland, a guy called Nigel McFarland, again, somebody who's trying to set up these small communities. So again and again and again, I'm seeing evidence for a great awakening, which is happening from the ground up, people building little communities. And I've had the privilege over the last year particularly to read and to watch some of the current crop of what I would say internationally recognized prophets who are risking ridicule and deplatforming for speaking their own truths. Because I've said to you many, many, many times that there's only one sin. Sin is not the infraction of a precept or the breaking of a commandment. That's kind of a second level or a tertiary level of sin. The only sin at a personal level, at a cultural level, or even at a global level is the refusal to do the work necessary to wake ourselves up as individuals, as communities, and as a global family. And perfection, I keep telling you, is perfection from the Greek word telos, which we find in the Gospels when Jesus says, "You must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." The word perfect in Greek is telos, from which we get the English word teleology. And teleology means to be attracted toward a goal. Perfection does not consist in a stainless steel sinlessness. That is not perfection. Perfection is being committed to the mission for which you incarnated. And that's the difference, as I tried to say in this small little book that I did with Matt McKay and Ralph Messner in 2013, there's a huge difference between happiness, joy, and pleasure. Happiness does not come from pleasure because all mammals, are habituate to pleasure. And it's not from joy. Joy is very short-lived. Watching a sunset, making love, whatever it is, it doesn't last. Happiness is being aligned with the purpose for which you incarnated. So happiness and perfection are soulmates. Perfection is the commitment to doing that which you said you would do, and happiness is the alignment with that purpose. And learning then is a feedback mechanism where even sin is important. Sin literally means just missing the mark with the arrow. And so you adjust your aim. So sin is a very important part of the feedback mechanism that allows us to determine whether or not previous efforts are good or we're missing the mark. So for me, that's part of the Great Awakening. Now, I want to dig much, much deeper into it now for the rest of the homily. And this was something I did in much more depth 2 or 3 years ago. I devoted an entire retreat, a COJ retreat, 3 days, 6 or 7 lectures, to the notion of the ascension process. You know, how we are meant to be ascending, not just as individuals, but as a global community and even as a cosmic community. So for me, when I think of ascension, I'm thinking basically about 3 different tracks. I'm talking about the ascension of an individual person in the course of a single incarnation during one lifetime. Secondly, I'm thinking about the evolution of an individual person in the course of many lifetimes, many incarnational experiences. And then thirdly, I'm looking at the ascension of humanity and maybe even the cosmos itself over all of the entirety of our 13.6 or 13.8 billion years that this particular cosmos has existed. So great minds throughout human history have tried to wrestle with this. Let me look at firstly at the journey of a single individual during a single lifetime. You know, what does that look like? And great, you know, writers, great artists and great scientists have tried to understand what this might look like. So we have, for instance, Confucius, who flourished about 550 years before Christ. And he talked about the 5 constant relationships, that it's our evolution through this process that creates enlightenment. And the 5 constant relationships, he said, are firstly, the relationship between a husband and a wife. Secondly, between parents and children. Thirdly, between the elder brother and the younger siblings. Fourthly, between the teacher and the student. And fifthly, between the emperor and the subjects. And as far as he was concerned, that was the movement, the evolutionary trajectory that took the individual, you know, into a state of harmony. You have people like, so for instance, within the Roman Catholic Church, we have this beautiful notion of the 7 sacraments, 7 initiation rites that lead us progressively in the course of the chronology of a single lifetime to try to draw nearer and nearer and nearer to source or to God. You have Shakespeare saying the very same thing. All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, each one in his time playing 7 roles. And he goes through the roles. So again, he's looking at the life trajectory and where it takes us and where it could take us. The very famous psychologist Erik Erikson talked about the 8 stages of psychosocial development or evolution. And so that's the movement, you know, from these great teachers. There's another model that I came up with myself, which is, you know, I call it a 4-stage model. When I look at the evolution of an individual person, and the first one is the evolution of self-awareness that happens between birth and about age 7, when each of us is identified with the ego. It takes time, it takes about 8 months after birth for a child to identify itself, so that when you call a particular name, it knows, yeah, that's me. And so the ego develops in about 8 months, but it takes about 7 years for the ego to fully be able to develop itself so that there's a real sense of self-awareness. So that would be one stage. A second stage would be from age 7 to about 12. And I would call it, you know, a self-regulation, where the child is being taught particular rules and particular roles. It's learning to be rational and to use its mind. And now it goes from egocentrism to ethnocentrism. Now it identifies with the tribe or with the family. So that's typically from about age 7 to age 12. Around age 12 and moving forward is a third phase that I'm going to call self-reflection, where the child is not just learning rules and roles and being obedient, but it's beginning to think for itself. It examines its own behavior and the behavior of its culture. And then it goes from ethnocentrism, identification with the tribe, to ecocentrism, identification with the entire species. And then some stage much, much later, and it doesn't happen for all of us in every incarnation, there is what I would call self-transcendence. And that's the realization that we have to go beyond. We go transpersonal and transrational and transspatial and transtemporal. And instead of being egocentric or ethnocentric or even ecocentric, we are now cosmocentric. So that would be a 4-stage model. And today I presented with you from Thomas a 6-stage model of what that evolutionary trajectory looks like. So here again is what Thomas had to say. He said, those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. And when they find, they will be disturbed. And when they're disturbed, they will marvel or be amazed. And when they are amazed, they will rule. And when they rule, they will rest. Now, how would you unpack that statement? It's a deeply, deeply mystical statement. And for me, it seems this is what it means. It means if you're truly committed to the spiritual journey, and anybody who's part of a spiritual community obviously is, anybody who's been raised in any kind of religious background, ostensibly, this was the journey you set for yourself. You wanted to seek the truth. And so you're looking what really makes sense to you. And some people will stay stuck in kind of a fundamental orthodoxy for all of their lives. And it's not going to make them happy campers, and they're certainly not going to grow. Going to be stuck, they're going to die the same way they were born, stuck with a fundamentalist mindset because they didn't seek. So seeking is the first part. When we seek, we will find there will be answers at every stage of the journey. If you're really, really looking and examining and experimenting, you're going to find answers. I guarantee you, they will be very, very, very disturbing because the world is never the way it was presented to you. Whether you were raised as a Roman Catholic or a fundamentalist Christian or a Muslim, it doesn't matter a damn. The world is not the way you were told it is. It is very, very different. There are some very dark players out there that you were being protected against. There were some people whom you believed in. There were the great leaders and teachers that you find were completely corrupt. So you're going to be very, very disturbed. If you search long enough and find, reality, you're going to be very disturbed at some of what you find. But when you go through that stage, a lot of people at that stage, they want to turn back and go back to the security of being told what the truth is. If you have the courage to push through that stage, then you get to the stage of marveling. You begin to see that that which disturbed you was only a particular perspective on reality, but that there are much higher levels of reality. And when you keep ascending, you'll access those. And when you access those, you're going to be amazed at the complexity of this extraordinary game that God has created for us. And that will allow you to rule over everything. Not in the sense that you have dominion or control over others, but that nothing will faze you again. That you can rule your emotions. You can rule your trajectory. You can harvest every single event in your life and learn to get grace and love and compassion from it. And at that stage, in some senses, you can then rest. In the sense that when you finally come to the realization that there is only God, that there is only love, that life is a dream that the ego is having, and that the ego is a dream that the soul is having, and the soul is a dream that spirit is having, and spirit is a dream that source is having, then you can rest because you realize ultimately there is only God and there is only love. So that's what I believe the journey of a single a lifetime would look like, or of an individual in a single lifetime. What would then the secular face of ascension look like for our entire species? I believe, for instance, that culture is the personality of the community. In the same way that, the interface between the soul and the environment creates an individual personality. In the same way, the interface between the community, and its experiences creates the culture of the community. So for me, culture is simply the personality of a community. And it contains many yardsticks of evolution. If you want to know how advanced a particular culture is, there are yardsticks that you can use to measure that. And a very easy metric to trace historically is the notion of the assignment of personhood to various individuals. As you watch different cultures assign personhood to different people, you can see how evolved they are or how repressive they are. So initially, in many, many cultures, the only persons were the male rulers. Nobody else had personhood. They were vassals of the male rulers. So initially, the only people on the planet, the only people with personhood were male rulers. And then at some stage, we find out that this personhood is being extended even to non-ruling males. So now all males are persons. That's the second stage. The third stage is finally we get it that even women are persons. And now we extend personhood to women. At some stage, we realize that even children are persons. And they're not just, kind of belongings to the parents. They're in their own right. And then we extend it to foreign races and indigenous tribes. And this took a long time. The last permit given in South Africa to hunt bushmen and kill them like they would kill lions was in 1936. Literally, in 1936, permits were still being issued by the big game hunters who came from all over the world to hunt, the big game, and they were allowed to kill bushmen because bushmen weren't people, they weren't humans, and they weren't persons. So a great metric of understanding where a culture is in its evolutionary trajectory is look at whom do they regard as person. So what will the future look like? When we think about this one metric of personhood, who will become a person who is not currently so? For instance, when does the unborn human become a person? If you look at what's happening right now, there's legislation to say that you can kill an unborn baby right up to the moment of birth. So obviously it seems that an unborn baby is not a person in some legislative thinking. When will we confer personhood on animals? When will we realize, for instance, that each of them has their individuality as a species? Each person, each animal within the species has its own individuality. So when will we confer personhood on animals and treat them accordingly? I mean, we've already done it with corporations. Corporations have the same rights, going back 100 years in our country as individual human beings have. When will we confer personhood on a forest or a river or a mountain? When will these warrant having legal rights? That for me will be the primary metric of looking at how evolution is happening or how evolution is not happening. Whom do we regard as being persons? So that's kind of the secular face of Ascension. What would the spiritual face of Ascension look like? So over the last 30 years in particular, I've had a whole bunch of visionary experiences, kind of interdimensional travel experiences, where I think I've seen clues to what the spiritual face of Ascension looks like. And I've shared most of these with you over the years. One of them was an experience of watching Gaia volunteering in front of God and saying, send me to that third rock from the sun in that solar system, and I will breed life. Until I finally managed to breed a life form capable of recognizing its own divinity and ipso facto the divinity of all other life forms with which it shares the planet. And I think we possibly have reached that place several times in our history, and we've blown it. And now we're on the edge of it again. Are we going to blow it this time, or are we going to break through? So that was one vision. A second one was watching a vision of the pregnant cosmos, where I could see into the belly of the cosmos and see her pregnant with planet Earth and see all the umbilical cords that connected the planet to the human beings. And there was this liquid flowing through those umbilical cords. Sometimes it was clear and vital, and sometimes it was gunky. And the mother's health reflected what was happening and moving through these cords. And what I was told was that the liquid in these cords is the thoughts, the words, and the actions of the individual human being. And they're creating health or kind of poor health for the mother who's carrying them. I remember saying in 2012, I've read it a few weeks ago, and an experience I had down at the creek in November or December 2012 that I called the gardeners, where I had a visit with some kind of an elemental being who told me that over eons, he had seeded, different planets with different possibilities for life. And he could always predict where it was going to go to until a species arose that had a willpower, self-will, and a technology to match. And he said at that stage, all bets are off. Sometimes it succeeds and they break through into a kind of a Christ consciousness, and sometimes they destroy themselves. So that was kind of a vision down at the creek in 2012. There was a vision of watching the entire globe being circumambulated by beings of light, a being of light stationed at every intersection point between a line of longitude and a line of latitude, and one at the North Pole and South Pole. And so there were these beings of light, like a lattice of light workers surrounding the planet, and I did the math on it subsequently, and it meant there were 64,442 beings of light stationed around the planet, beaming love and light at us. Now that's a kind of a symbolic number, obviously. It's much greater, in my opinion, that the number 64,442. I've just shared with you today the vision of the beach, of being elevated above the beach and seeing these people form the two hemispheres, and the statement, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. So to finish, I just want to mention this extraordinary teaching, maybe the culmination, the quintessential distillation of the teaching of Jesus. You know, I've said to you many times that storytelling is the archived wisdom of a culture. But if you want to get the radical distillation of the stories, go to the Proverbs. So basically, the Beatitudes are 8 Proverbs. That's basically what they are, where Christ distills the essence of his 3-year ministry to these 8 statements. And for me, then the Beatitudes become they become a love song and a mantra in the style of Hebrew poetry, using what's called Semitic parallelism, where you revisit the same idea using different nouns to articulate it. And so for me, Jesus talks very powerfully about a new breed of human beings. And in the Gnostic Gospels, there's a special phrase for that. They call it the true human being, distinguishing between ordinary human beings who are not ascended or even awake, and true human beings who understand who they really are, that they're bite-sized bits of source, and that so is the bunny rabbit, and so is the oak tree, and so is the mountain, that they're all words of God enfleshed. And so that's what Christ is saying in his ministry. Eventually, I believe that if we break through, if enough of us awaken and break through, that the Sermon on the Mount will actually reflect human behavior at an intrapsychic level, at an interpersonal level, at an international level, and at an interspecial level. And at that time then, the Sermon on the Mount must be sung again and again, in the same way that a mother sings a soothing lullaby to her fever-ridden infant. It is Christa comforting the Christ child. Namaste.